everyone but one person named Bob. And Bob says, excuse me, but my food matters. Everybody says, well, everybody's food matters. But Bob is the only person not being served. So Bob's food matters at that point. It's a similar situation. So we talked about a lot of things, and my neighbor, who's quite an educated man, said, well, why is it that I've never learned any of these things? He didn't know about restrictive deed covenants. He didn't know about redlining. He didn't know about not being able to take advantage of veterans' benefits for Black members of the armed forces. He didn't know any of this. And I said, that's because it wasn't taught to you in schools. And right now, actively, people are trying to restrict people's education on what has happened in the United States. And that's the thing. People think, oh, if you say anything bad about the US or our history or how we've treated people, it's somehow being un-American. But it's not being un-American at all. It's by looking frankly at the truth of our history that will allow us to be a better country moving forward. And so it's very important that we're taught about how people have been treated and how moving forward we can do better so that as a country we're more successful. And so this is just where you can click to read my
link.
My article.
Yeah.
Thank you. And so back in 1967, after the civil rights laws had been passed, my mom and dad decided that they wanted to own a home. And so they did all of the things that you're supposed to do. My father had a very good job with General Electric. My mother was a stay-at-home caregiver. They went and they looked at a number of properties around Syracuse. They would find a property and they would put a purchase offer in, but then they would be told that there was a deed restriction that said that they could not sell the properties to Black people. And so they would say, okay, well, because there's all these deed restrictions and there's no way that we can get around this, why don't we have a property built? And so they found some land in Liverpool, New York, and they found a builder who would build them a home. And my dad went to the bank to get the mortgage, and he was entitled to VA loan, and he showed his discharge papers and everything that he was supposed to show. But in that industry, basically what happens is a bank wants you to have mortgage insurance. In New York, it's Sony Mae. They provide mortgage insurance, and it says that if the person cannot pay their loan, then the mortgage insurance will make sure that the bank is whole. So most banks will not give a mortgage without mortgage insurance unless you put down, say, 80% loan to value or something crazy, and people just don't have that money. So, but you can't just apply yourself for mortgage insurance. You need the loan officer to do it for you. And the loan officer, seeing that my father was a Black man, refused to apply for the mortgage insurance, and he was denied the mortgages. So additionally, the mortgage insurance at the time was provided through the federal home agencies, FHA. FHA did everything in their power almost to prevent Black people from owning homes or from allowing homes to gain value. Right up, I would say, through the 80s and 90s, they would do things called redlining. And this book, The Color of Law, talks about all the laws at the time that prevented Black people from building equity. So when you go into your own neighborhood and you look around and your neighborhood looks great and you see a neighbor and they're putting a new roof on their house, a lot of times people use a home equity loan. They take out some of the value of their property to be able to put in a new roof or a new kitchen or upgrade the bathrooms to make their home look good and be more sellable. Well, these home equity loans also rely on mortgage insurance. What FHA did was they put red lines around neighborhoods largely by race. It didn't matter how valuable the houses were or what the housing stock looked like. They looked at census data, and if a neighborhood was largely occupied by black or brown people, they put a red line around it, and they said, we will not provide mortgage insurance to these communities. And so banks would not allow people to get home equity loans. Not only would they not allow people to get home equity loans, but if you wanted to even buy a house or a business in that community, you could not get a business loan or a mortgage to buy that property. And so values fell because the only people who could buy properties were people who had the cash to pay. And they knew that they could put basically pennies on the dollar and buy homes for little of their value in black and brown neighborhoods, as well as people couldn't maintain their homes. Imagine what your neighborhood would look like if nobody was allowed to get a mortgage to buy a home in your community. Nobody was allowed to use a home equity loan to put on a new roof or new windows or make improvements. This happened for generations. So when people drive through communities and they say, my gosh, look at this place, look at the roofs, look at the condition of the housing, that is a direct result of not being able to have equity in communities. And typically these communities, everybody works. People work, they work regular jobs, but they don't have enough extra cash to be able to pay for high value expenses like a roof or a new kitchen. So basically you are dead in the water from this. Now, I'm going to talk a little bit about my dad's mindset. And my dad is the black man in the middle, having Bishop Sheen autograph his yearbook. And my dad has notes in his hand because he also wrote for the school newspaper. Now, my family is from Syracuse, New York, and Bishop Sheen had one of the most popular television shows at the time in the 50s and 60s called Life is Worth Living. He was also a huge, it says our free meeting minute will end in 10 minutes for Zoom. I don't know what we do here.
I don't either.
Okay, so anyway, so he wanted to desegregate all Catholic schools in Syracuse, but he needed black students to do that. And thus the Lynch family came in. They had 10 kids. So every child went to a different Catholic school in Syracuse to desegregate them. So my father was the only black student at Most Holy Rosary High School. He ended up having friends that were largely white and started to develop a mindset where he wanted a lot of the things that they had. He wanted a college education. He wanted a nice new home. He wanted a job, and he was a mathematical genius. My father excelled in math, and so he wanted to be an engineer, and he didn't realize those things weren't for him. When he went to the guidance counselor told him that college was not for him, so my dad enlisted in the Navy. When he enlisted in the Navy, he was told the engineering program was not for black men. He could clean the barnacles, he could be a valet, he could work as a cook, he could swab the deck, but he was not going to be placed in the engineering program. However, my father was also excellent at fixing electronics. And so word got around the ship that if you had a radio that was broken or something was broken, my father could fix it. So everybody took their things to my dad. One day on the USS Rhone, the radar was down. Nobody could fix it. The engineer was getting very upset and angry, and some said, well, there's a Negro on board, he can fix everything, why don't you call him? So the guy said, I don't care if he's purple or orange, you get that guy down here. My dad came in, he found the fuse where the radar wasn't working. He said, Miriam, it was like God showed me where it was. He replaced it. In the room where he was, there was only room for one individual. No one could take credit for what he did, and he was placed in that engineering program, and he became an engineer. And then he met my mom, and my mom wanted a house. My mother's from Haiti. She didn't understand American racism and didn't understand what they would face. Put a lot of pressure on my dad that she wanted a house like the ones that she saw on the TV, and they had to come up with a plan pretty quick. because I was on the wedding. That's their wedding picture. But unfortunately, here's some of the deed language that they faced. And so my father with GE, they had a job opportunity where he could go to Alaska and work for 1 year, where he could make almost 3 times his salary. So he left my mom and I, we lived with my grandmother. He went up to Alaska and he sent back the lion's share of his paychecks until my mom and dad could actually pay cash. They didn't need a mortgage, and they had this house built in Liverpool, New York. And this is me and the little, I don't know if you could see, in the little green dress with my sister, my aunts, my cousins, they all came over. But you know, you get a house and you're the only black people in the neighborhood. People weren't necessarily thrilled. This was on Driftwood Drive in Liverpool. And so when we first moved in, you'll see that there's a fence here around the backyard. And that's because somebody spray painted "Go Home" and "Word" on the back of our home. And my mom and dad had to paint it over, and then they put a fence there to try to keep people away. And we got a dog out of it. That was Laffy, our dog, and he would bark. We had a brick thrown through the window. We had people drive on the lawn. We had all kinds of things happen. But the one thing it taught me is perseverance. My parents just quietly cleaned everything. When somebody rode on the lawn, my dad put stones up. He put fencing around the backyard. My mother planted flowers. He replaced the window. And we just lived there until people got used to us. And then it was time for me to go to school. This is my kindergarten picture. Word had gotten out that a black child would be going to Nate Perry Elementary, and my parents were alerted by the principal that there could be violence, people throwing rocks at my bus, or angry people waiting for me to get off the bus because they didn't want a black child going to school with their kids. And so the principal met me at the bus, and I think that they didn't know I was black, because I don't remember anybody yelling or screaming at me. And you know, you go through some things. Some kids weren't allowed to be my friends, but other kids were. And you know, you just go with the good and ignore the bad. And I just thought, well, they're lost. And so this is just some of my ancestry. This woman, her name is Lucinda Christmas Fitz. She was born enslaved. She's my father's grandmother. So this is how close slavery is. I mean, my father held this woman's hand, and I'm going to see my father after this presentation. So, you know, my father held the hand of a woman who was born enslaved. She was the product of rape between an enslaved woman and the master of the plantation. He had her as well as her brother. The brother, slavery is a strange thing. He sent to law school after the slaves were freed. But Lucinda, she ended up marrying a freed black man in North Carolina. Her last name is Christmas, and from my understanding, there are a number of Christmases in North Carolina who all came from the Fitz plantation, managed to find each other after the Civil War and create a community. And then these are my mom's parents. Her father was Maurice. He was a dentist in Harlem, New York. His mother, her mother's Salida. Salida was a chef and a cook, as well as a person who grew coffee beans and had her own coffee business for many years. So both from Haiti. My mom grew up in Harlem, met my dad, had a lot of expectations, and my father defied everything in order to make them true. And some people might look at this and say, but that happened in the 60s, it's still not happening. But just because civil rights were ratified didn't mean that white people said, oh, all right, you can buy this house, or you can go to schools, or, you know, you can sit on the bus. Right after, you know, the bus boycott stopped and people didn't have to sit in the back of the bus, I mean, white people bombed people's houses after that. There were a series of house bombings. During Reconstruction, when black people left and said, we'll form our own communities, and those communities became successful. There are dozens of black communities that were systematically wiped out by white mobs and their possessions stolen. There were pools in most communities that were restricted to only white people. And in 1964, when it said you have to share these pools that are created by taxpayers' money, communities chose to cement them in rather than have their children swim with black children. Racism hurts everyone. When people decide that they are better or more entitled or more deserving of things in their communities, typically they cut off their nose to spite their face. They deny their children free lunch, which was standard before the civil rights era. They deny their children a community pool. They deny successful schools. They deny wonderful neighbors. And so these things continue, and sometimes it's just like, well, we want to keep that green space. We don't want affordable housing. Sometimes it's like, well, our schools are good because our taxes are higher. But why is the value of a school based on how expensive your house is? That's not right. You know, there are so many things that we take for granted. We give businesses pilot programs because we want them to create jobs, but yet entire generations of people were systematically deprived of earning equity, but we never think maybe we should do a pilot program to do reverse redlining. And I just wanted to bring this to your attention as a person who experienced this, so maybe that we could think a little bit differently and move forward working together for a better United States. Thanks for having me.
Thank you.